Hey everyone, it's Glenn Greenwald back with a new episode of System Update exclusively on Rumble. And I wanted to discuss the, I think, quite fascinating reaction to the speech delivered on September 11th by former President George W. Bush. He was speaking at a ceremony at the site where the plane on 9/11 crashed in Pennsylvania, along with others such as former Vice President Dick Cheney and current Vice President Kamala Harris. And he gave a speech that was remarkably well received by numerous prominent liberals for reasons I think are quite important to understand, particularly his attempt to equate the war on terror that he launched and the people at whom that war on terror was directed with the current domestic war on terror that liberals are launching and the people at whom they're launching it, which are their political adversaries here in the United States. So if you look at how media outlets described Bush's comments here, for example, you can see CNN, who promoted the speech, and underneath it says, Bush alludes to January 6th while condemning 9/11 terrorists. And that was absolutely the connection he intended to be drawn and was drawn by numerous liberals, essentially saying that there was a similarity between the attacks on September 11th and the Capitol riot on January 6th, and that the people who perpetrated the attacks on September 11th and killed 3,000 people all at once are very similar to the people who are responsible for right-wing extremism in the United States, including those who did 1/6. Now let's listen to the specific passage that became the most consequential and important one, the one that CNN is referencing here.
And we have seen growing evidence that the dangers to our country can come not only across borders, but from violence that gathers within. There is little cultural overlap between violent extremists abroad and violent extremists at home. But in their disdain for pluralism, in their disregard for human life, in their determination to defile national symbols, they are children of the same foul spirit, and it is our continuing duty to confront them.
Now, what I found so fascinating about the reaction to the speech from liberals is a number of things, beginning with, let's remember how liberals talked about George W. Bush at the time that he was actually the president, because it's very radically different from how they talked about him yesterday and how they've been talking about him ever since he began condemning Donald Trump. There's a lot of historical revisionism going on. Maybe some people don't remember how liberals spoke about him during his presidency. Maybe some people have forgotten, but it's really worth revisiting what they said. So here, for example, is a New York Times report in January of 2004, discussing the tendency on the part of liberals to compare George W. Bush to Adolf Hitler. It was prompted by an ad by the liberal advocacy group Move On that was a contestant in a Move On ad that directly compared Bush to Hitler. But in general, the comparison between George Bush and Adolf Hitler was a common and a commonly accepted one in liberal discourse. It led to that New York Times article. Very often as well, there would be attempts to compare the Bush family to Adolf Hitler. Here you see The Guardian in September of 2004, so shortly before the election, with an article entitled How Bush's Grandfather Helped Hitler's Rise to Power. So trying to connect George Bush and his family to the rise of Adolf Hitler. Here from CNN in 2013, there is an article that argues that George Bush, along with Tony Blair, should be charged with war crimes. So he is like Hitler, his family's linked to Hitler, and the rise of Hitler, he's a war criminal. Here we have an article in New York Magazine from 2012 by Jonathan Chait saying, yes, Bush versus Gore did steal the election. That is a common theme still to this very day in liberalism, that George Bush stole the 2000 election, that the results of the 2000 election were illegitimate. They were the byproduct of Bush stealing the election. And they think the same thing about the 2004 election. So here's an article from CNN in January of 2005 on how members of Congress, the Democrats in Congress, were challenging Ohio's electoral votes. Ohio was the key state that swung George Bush's reelection over John Kerry. And you can see the first paragraph of CNN alleging widespread, quote, irregularities on election day. A group of Democrats in Congress objected Thursday to the counting of Ohio's 20 electoral votes, delaying the official certification of the 2004 presidential election. So they also thought he stole both the 2000 and the 2004 election. Many people thought his victory in each was illegitimate, much like Republicans now believe about Joe Biden and much like Democrats believed about Trump's victory in 2016. So that's how George Bush was talked about. And just to give you a sense of how extreme it is, a lot of prominent liberals believe that George Bush was actually responsible for the 9/11 attack, either planning it and participating in its execution along with Dick Cheney, or negligently and purposely allowing it to happen. The current MSNBC personality, Joy Reid, who has a very prominent position with MSNBC, although no one watches her show, essentially. She's still a primetime host. She had a blog, a very notorious blog. Oh, here, by the way, before I get to that, is a book that was popular among liberals. It's still on Amazon. It was entitled What Happened in Ohio, a documentary record of theft and fraud in the 2004 election. And it says an array of primary evidence documents the dishonesty and disenfranchisement that tipped the election in 2004 to George W. Bush. That was a common theme. Now, here's Joy Reid on her blog. This is an article from BuzzFeed in 2018, and it reads, Joy Reid promoted an infamous 9/11 conspiracy documentary on her own blog, and she herself connected George Bush to Al-Qaeda and the 9/11 attacks. This was her article from the anniversary, the 6-year anniversary of 9/11 in 2007, entitled Unhappy Anniversary, and she raised the issue explicitly. She wrote, quote, is Al-Qaeda a trumped up fantasy designed to perpetuate Bush's corporate wars? Has it been resolved, wrote Joy Reid, to most people's satisfaction that the Bush administration had nothing to do with 9/11? I think the answer here is clearly no. That's how liberals talked about Bush. He was Hitler. His family helped Hitler's rise. He stole the 2000 election. He stole the 2004 election. He was a war criminal who deserved to be prosecuted at The Hague. And maybe he even did 9/11. You couldn't have said worse things about George W. Bush than liberals said about him for 8 years during his presidency, at least as bad, if not worse than what they say now about Donald Trump. Now, all of that changed when George Bush began softly criticizing Donald Trump. And yesterday, with his speech at 9/11, there was no talk about him being a war criminal, or very little, or about him having done any of those things. Instead, it was effusive praise from some of the most prominent liberals in the United States, and in particular, praise for his equating 9/11 with January 6th, the war on terror that he launched with the war on terror domestically that already has been launched by the Biden administration, in which liberals want to escalate. Now, let's look at a few representative examples. Here's from former President Bill Clinton, who cites George Bush's speech on Twitter, and he wrote above it, "Thank you, my friend, for your powerful and much-needed words on this difficult day." That's Bill Clinton. Here is Keith Olbermann, who not only tweeted, but then retweeted himself, the founding father of the current version of MSNBC. And he isolated the part of the speech where Bush compared 9/11 to 1/6 and said, and there it is, even George W. Bush now recognizes Trump, his supporters, and those who directly participated in the 1/6 coup attempt are terrorists, surely as the 9/11 ones were. I'll say it again. Trump damaged America in a way only bin Laden dreamed of. Essentially, 1/6 to Keith Olbermann is worse than 9/11, and he's thrilled that George W. Bush, who is the person to whom Keith Olbermann owes his career by going on MSNBC every night and calling him fascist and Hitlerian and Nazi-like, is now someone who deserves his praise. Here is a tweet from Senator Scott Wiener, who is one of the leaders of the Democratic Party in the state Senate in California, who says, quote, "As we commemorate the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and the horror that it brought, let's recommit to fighting all forms of terrorism, including the greatest terror threat we face, white nationalist, domestic terrorism." So this linkage that George Bush gave between 1/6 and 9/11, between Al-Qaeda and Trump supporters, is one that, as you can see, is fundamental and crucial to liberal discourse, which is why they swooned so effusively over that part of Bush's speech. Here is Michael Beschloss, the historian who in reality is a liberal. Listen to what he said about Bush's speech. Quote, "Almost weeping, George W. Bush rebukes those Americans who have turned their back on, quote, the America I know." Important speech. You think that's how liberals were talking about George W. Bush before he started saying that Trump supporters are similar to Al-Qaeda? Here is another prominent liberal. She's a columnist for the Daily Beast and also an heiress to a famous and rich family on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, Molly Young-Fast, who quoted that part of the speech, which was also highlighted by Vox's Aaron Ruper, the part where George Bush said about 9/11, quote, "We have seen growing evidence that the dangers to our country can come not only from across borders, but violence that gathers within, that are children of the same foul spirit." And Molly Young-Fast, the Daily Beast columnist and heiress to that family, said, "He got us, Trump, but he's also right about Trump." Here is the neocon columnist from the Washington Post, who was a huge fan of the first war on terror, is an even bigger fan of the second one domestically. And this is what she said about George Bush's speech and that part of it in promoting her column in the Washington Post. Quote, "In perhaps the most important words spoken in his political career, Bush, in his remarks at the crash site of United Airlines Flight 93, drew a straight line between the 9/11 terrorists and the 1/6 terrorist." And the title of her article in the Washington Post that she promotes is, "Yes, the January 6th insurrectionists were terrorists. George W. Bush just indicted them." Now, this is a remarkable point to have liberals so attached to, that 9/11 is the equivalent of January 6th, and that the people who killed 3,000 Americans and flew a plane into the Pentagon and knocked down two buildings in the World Trade Center and devastated the United States are similar in character to the people who were at the Capitol on 1/6 who protested for 3 hours, and that they ought to be treated the same. That it comes from, in Bush's words, that they're all swooning over the same foul spirit. Now, liberals have been exploiting the 9/11 attacks for many years, trying to insist that what is being done to them politically is similar to what was done to the country on 9/11. The idea that, for example, Russian bots and fake Facebook ads and Russian hacking that in their view helped elect Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton was equivalent to Pearl Harbor and the 9/11 attacks is something we heard from liberals often. Here, for example, in the Washington Post in October of 2018 is a headline, "Hillary Clinton compares Russian interference in 2016 to the 9/11 attacks." That's how Hillary Clinton saw it. Here is the New York Times columnist Tom Friedman on Morning Joe making the same exact equivalency. You'll listen to it now.
We have never taken seriously from the very beginning, Russia hacked our election. That was a 9/11 scale event. They attacked the core of our very democracy. That was a Pearl Harbor scale event. Can you imagine if Hillary Clinton, where Trump was, what the right would be doing on this issue? This goes to the very core of our democracy.
So they're just making that equivalency over and over. And here is how newscasters talked about it. Here is how Nancy Pelosi discussed it. In 2018, I wrote an article, "A consensus emerges. Russia committed a, quote, act of war on par with Pearl Harbor and 9/11. And I asked the question, should the U.S. response to Russia be similar to 9/11? They were doing this over and over. And Nancy Pelosi herself has constantly equated the 9/11 attacks to January 6th as well.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi wants a 9/11 style commission to look into that insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. She told House Democrats today she plans to take steps to form a panel to investigate and report on the facts and causes relating to the assault. Both the House and Senate would need to approve such a commission.
So you can see over and over the equation is to between 9/11 and 1/6. Now, why is this so important to liberals? It's because they have made it a top priority to launch a new war on terror. George Bush is most historically linked to the first war on terror. So to hear him say, this is like the first war on terror, these people are like the terrorists we attacked first, is music to their ears, because it is a top priority of the Democratic Party to treat Trump supporters and the American right as terrorists and extremists who deserve the same kind of treatment as those who did 9/11. Here is an article from the Wall Street Journal on November 13th, 2020, so very shortly after the election, before obviously Joe Biden was inaugurated, the headline of which was Biden administration urged to take a fresh look at domestic terrorism. So this was on the top of their agenda even before January 6th, to tackle domestic terrorism. And here was the first paragraph of the Wall Street Journal article to give you a sense of how they were thinking. President-elect Joe Biden, who has said he plans to make a priority of passing a law against domestic terrorism, has also been urged to create a White House post overseeing the fight against ideologically inspired violent extremists and increasing funding to combat them, according to people who have advised his team. Now, again, this is prior to January 6th. Just like a lot of neocons wanted to invade Iraq prior to 9/11, and then seized on 9/11 as the excuse to scare people into doing it, they wanted to launch a new war on terror domestically, to enact new domestic terrorism laws even before January 6th. And January 6th is what they then seized upon. That's why it's so important for them to compare it to 9/11. So here in February 13th, so about a month and a week after the January 6th riot at the Capitol, you see a new Wall Street Journal headline that reads, "A domestic terrorism law is debated anew after the Capitol riot." Now, Joe Biden has been saying explicitly that he regards the greatest threat to American national security not as being Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan or ISIS in Iraq or Syria or any other foreign threat, not China, not Russia, not Iran, none of them. He's been explicit about the fact that he and his intelligence community believe that the greatest national security threat to the United States are your fellow citizens, who in their view have political ideologies that make them dangerous extremists. Listen to him say that in his own words. This is Biden on June 1st, 2021.
The joint session of Congress, according to the intelligence community, terrorism from white supremacy is the most lethal threat to the homeland today. Not ISIS, not Al-Qaeda, white supremacists.
This is their view. They want a new war on terror against your fellow citizens. Now, he says they're white supremacists, which, as we know, is a term that is so broad, it can mean anything. In fact, Larry Elder, the African-American Republican candidate for governor in California, is frequently being labeled a white supremacist. It means essentially anyone who opposes the Democratic Party. That's the functional equivalent of it. In the intelligence documents, they refer not just to white supremacists, but to all extremists on both the left and the right, people who are anti-government or otherwise want to use civil disobedience or other forms of disruptive activism to challenge the status quo. Now, it's so vital to look at the law that they're talking about enacting, that the Wall Street Journal reported multiple times Joe Biden wants to implement in the name of fighting domestic terrorism, because in that law, you see why the 9/11 framework is the one they want to use. The law, the principal law that is pending, is one that has as its primary sponsor, Congressman Adam Schiff, the Democrat from California, one of the most hawkish members of the Congress, obviously one of the most demented Russiagate conspiracy theorists throughout 5 years of the Trump campaign and then the Trump presidency, constantly lying, saying he knew of evidence linking the Trump campaign to Russian interference, something that Robert Mueller said he was unable to establish. The bill that they want to enact is one sponsored by him, and it's very simple. all it does is take the current legislation about terrorism that was used as the basis for the first war on terror, launched by George Bush and Dick Cheney after 9/11, and just amend it to add the phrase "and domestic terrorist organizations" too. That's it. And then all those powers that were used in the first war on terror can be used against your fellow citizens. So this is his bill here, and it says very simply, the bill is to amend Title 18 United States Code to provide for an offense for the acts of terrorism occurring in the territorial jurisdiction of the United States and for other purposes. That's all it does, is amend the current bill. Here you see it again. All it does, Section 2, acts of terrorism occurring in the United States. Chapter 113B of Title 18 of the U.S. Code shall be amended to insert, quote, acts of terrorism occurring in the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. So it just takes the war on terror framework after 9/11 and imports it domestically, period, end of story. The title that he wants to amend is the title on terrorism. That's 18 USC Chapter 113B, which is what regulates terrorism. He just wants to take this chapter that was used as the legal authority for the first war on terror and enable it to be used domestically by just adding that phrase. This is what they want to do. And it's not that they only want to do this. That's the legal change they want to make. But they have been already launching a second war on terror in the name of stopping domestic terrorism based on the premise George Bush ratified as they swooned, that 9/11 was like 1/6, that Al-Qaeda is like the people who were at the Capitol on January 6th. So here, for example, is a series of warnings issued by Homeland Security, 4 of them in the first part of the year, warning that these right-wing extremists are going to launch terrorist attacks. You might remember that Tom Ridge, who was the director of Homeland Security, the first one once Homeland Security was created in 2002 after the 9/11 attacks, used to do this all the time. They would publish very vague warnings. The threat level has been escalated, to scare the population constantly whenever the fear level was receding, to keep fear levels high. They would never be specific. They had a color-coded system to keep fear levels high. And oftentimes, most often, in fact, it never happened. This is what Homeland Security has been doing for the first part of the year, is claiming that you should be afraid of your fellow citizens who have conservative or right-wing ideologies through these bulletins that never come to pass. Here's one on January 15th of this year. New security bulletin says domestic extremists, most likely threat to the inauguration. They were warning the inauguration was likely to be attacked. Here is another National Terrorism Advisory System bulletin from January of 2021, so a couple of weeks later, warning that there is a heightened threat environment across the United States that is likely to persist over the coming weeks. And they admitted, we don't have any information to indicate a specific credible plot. However, violent riots have continued in recent days, and we remain concerned that individuals frustrated with the exercise of government authority and the presidential transition, as well as other perceived grievances and ideological causes fueled by false narratives, could continue to mobilize a broad range of ideologically motivated actors to incite or commit violence. Another advisory that never happened, though it was incredibly vague. In May, they warned that violent extremists could, quote, exploit the easing of coronavirus capacity restrictions. It was a warning claiming there'd be widespread violence and terrorist threats as a result of anger by domestic extremists over COVID restrictions, and that the easing of COVID restrictions would allow people more freedom and it would lead to more terrorist attacks. That too never happened. And then in May, 2 weeks after that, they said Homeland Security says the commemorations of the Tulsa race massacre could be the target of white supremacists, but there is no specific threat. So they issued another warning that it was likely that there'd be terrorist attacks surrounding the Tulsa race massacre. Now it says there is no specific threat, and that's only because CNN was forced to add that. Originally, it just said, warning, Homeland Security warns that there could be white supremacists engaging in violence around the Tulsa ceremony. They added that in an update at the end of the article, and they were kind of forced into that. Now, none of these warnings ever came to fruition, and sometimes media outlets were forced to admit that. So here's the Washington Post on January 20th. acknowledging that the threat about the inauguration issued by DHS to scare everyone that after January 6th there'd be attacks on the inauguration at state capitals or federal ones simply never happened. This is what they wrote, quote, "There is a general threat to all 50 state capitals," said the governor of Colorado as he deployed the National Guard. Thousands of National Guard troops had been deployed to capitals across the country late last week, ahead of a weekend in which potentially violent demonstrators were predicted by the FBI, but never materialized. Once again on Wednesday, security officials' worst fears weren't borne out. In some states, it was close to business as usual. In others, demonstrations were small and peaceful with only occasional tense moments. So you see over and over that these advisories that were designed to raise fear levels never came to pass. Now, here is the Tulsa race one, as I said, and here's the update from CNN after they scared everybody and then were forced to add at the end, quote, "This story has been updated with the additional information from DHS that there is no specific or credible threats at the time." Now, we've seen war on terror-like measures, usually quietly, coming from the Biden administration beyond things like these advisories, beyond the attempt for new legislation to create a second war on terror from Adam Schiff. Here, for example, is a CNN article from May warning that the Biden team may partner with private firms to monitor extremist chatter online. They're just everything that they can do to spy on us more, to monitor us more, to spend more money on more policing, to give themselves more powers in the name of stopping terrorism was modeled on what George Bush did and Dick Cheney did in the first war on terror. This one, though, is domestic. In March, I wrote about how reports that they were issuing were likely illegal because the CIA was working with DHS on collecting data about American citizens, something that they're prohibited by their charter and by law to doing, in order to issue warnings from DHS about which citizens ought to be monitored. One of the worst abuses of the first war on terror was the no-fly list. I wrote about it all the time. Almost every liberal and leftist denounced it by putting Muslims on these lists that banned them from flying without having to charge them with any crimes in court or having to prove that they were guilty. They would just ban them from flying. This is what they want to do with people they claim were involved at January 6th and have been doing. So here's the Democratic congressman who leads the Homeland Security Committee in the House, Benny Thompson, the Democrat from Michigan, who said he wants the TSA and the FBI to place Capitol rioters on the no-fly list. Quote, "I am urging the TSA and the FBI to use their authorities to add the names of all identified individuals involved in the attack to the federal no-fly list and keep them off planes." Just stealing the Bush-Cheney playbook that the ACLU sued over, that liberals and leftists denounced as a grave abuse of civil liberties when it was done to foreigners. Now they want to do it to American citizens. Bar them from flying before they're even charged with or convicted of any crime, before they're proven to have done anything wrong. Do you see how their mindset is identical to the one George Bush and Dick Cheney adopted, which is why neocons who supported the first war on terror, like Jennifer Rubin, are with the Democratic Party and Bill Kristol and those types because they want it. And Democratic leaders are calling for the use of those defining weapons of the first war on terror to be used in this one. Let's listen to the senior Democrat in Washington, Chuck Schumer, the Senate majority leader in the Democratic majority leader in the Senate. Listen to him call for American citizens who have been convicted of no crime to be placed on the no-fly list.
Ahead of the concern for possible future attacks, and with the law on our side, we are to say that these insurrectionists, many of whom are known to be at large, should not be able to hop on a flight. We are here today because the people, the insurrectionists who breached the U.S. Capitol fall under the definition of threats to the homeland and should be immediately added to the TSA no-fly list. Any of those who are inside the Capitol should not be able to fly and should be placed on the no-fly list. We are calling on the authorities, FBI, TSA, Department of Homeland Security to put them on the no-fly list immediately.
Now, this has been probably the principal topic of my reporting throughout 2021, are all of the authoritarian measures that the movement of American liberalism and the Democratic Party are seeking to enact in the name of fighting terrorism. They're very similar to the ones that were used by George Bush and Dick Cheney to fight the first war on terror, to say nothing of the new one that is probably most important to them, which is censoring the internet in the name of fighting extremism. But even if you leave that one aside, the key weapons, obviously they're not looking to bomb people, because you can't bomb your fellow citizens because that will end up bombing yourself. But the legal framework of denying people the rights that they have with no due process, of empowering police agencies, federal police agencies, the FBI, the NSA, the CIA, in the name of fighting domestic terrorism, amending the legal framework of the first war on terror to apply to American soil, are incredibly authoritarian and pernicious priorities that the movement of American liberalism wants. And that was why it was so important to them to hear the person most linked to the first war on terror justify their agenda, that 9/11 is like 1/6, that Al Qaeda is like Trump supporters, and that we have to treat the first war, this current war on terror, like we treated the first war on terror, which is why George Bush transformed from a Hitlerian, Nazi, fascist, authoritarian war criminal who steals elections into a very good and decent man who, even if I have political disagreements with him, is patriotic and sees these connections. There is no more important issue right now in American political life than the assault on civil liberties by the Democratic Party in the name of fighting what they call extremism. You see that it was already underway even before January 6th. January 6th became the pretext for it. And so I was opposed to that war on terror. It's why I stopped practicing law and began writing about politics and doing journalism, was to denounce the civil liberties abuses of the first war on terror. And so I'm in the same position. I'm opposed to the second war on terror for the same reasons, even more so because now it's domestic. What's changed, though, are so many of these liberals and Democrats who pretended to be against the first war on terror and now are itching to launch one against their fellow citizens, against their political adversaries. And that is why I found George Bush's remarks and the reaction to them yesterday on 9/11 to be so consequential. And I wanted